What's the newest generation Tundra like to live with after over 2 years and about 40,000 miles? Coming from a longtime Tundra owner, I'll give you my honest opinion from the everyday drivability as well as answering whether or not I miss the V8. Watch to the end because you'll probably be surprised. If you enjoy automotive content and find this video helpful, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. My favorite part about the cab of this truck is that you feel like you're sitting inside the cockpit, whereas the last generation felt like you were sitting really high up and on top of the seat, even with it adjusted all the way down. This truck is very comfortable, but unfortunately, the seats don't seem to be quite as nice as the last generation, at least compared to the older Platinum seats, which had a softer foam than the lower trim levels. The bottom of the seat doesn't adjust up as much for some reason, creating an almost lack of thigh support even with the thigh extension extended. On the 1794, Platinum, and Capstone, the thigh extension does extend way out from the seat bottom, but it still feels flat and lacking thigh support. I start to get a little uncomfortable after just an hour of driving due to how hard and flat the bottom of these seats are. It's not a huge deal, but just odd that the seats aren't as comfortable as before. They actually resemble the seats from the 2007 to 2013 Tundra. Getting in and out is very easy now that the grab handle was added back, and the power running boards also help, and I especially like that you can turn them on and off. Overall, the interior is comfortable aside from the seats. This Tundra is very easy and much more car-like to drive than the outgoing one. Handling is much more nimble and tight, and cornering is effortless in comparison. There's very little nosedive when braking, which is a nice improvement from before. It's still a truck, so you're not going to confuse it with a sedan, but this improvement really makes it much more enjoyable and easier to drive around town, through parking lots, and in everyday traffic. Braking feel is also improved with a much more responsive feel. Instead of having to press the pedal relatively hard, it's easy to bring the truck to a stop, and the pedal feels really nice without being too firm. The ride comfort is about the same as before, but it's not a huge difference. It would be even better if these tires were replaced with some high-quality Michelins that ride smoother and are quieter. When it comes to power, the Turbo V6 has more power overall. The 0 to 60 time is a little bit better than the V8, but the best part is the low-end torque. This engine has an incredible amount of low-end grunt, which is especially noticeable when accelerating moderately or when towing. It just does everything effortlessly, and it's extremely quiet since you never feel the need to wind it out. There is the slightest amount of turbo lag when you mash the throttle off the line or decide to suddenly accelerate on the highway, but really any vehicle is going to have some amount of lag between when you step on the gas from the time it downshifts and begins producing power, so it's not annoying to me. If you have a lead foot, you're definitely going to appreciate the extra torque, but if you drive normally most of the time and don't do much towing, it's not really something you're going to be taking advantage of. This truck does tow extremely well, mostly thanks to the new engine and 10-speed transmission. Initially, you'd think a turbo V6 wouldn't have the same capacity as a V8, but where the V8 would be screaming, this engine is hardly breaking a sweat. It tows almost like a diesel thanks to the extremely low-end torque, and it will pull strong, almost off idle, all the way to the red line. It doesn't need to drop 2 or 3 gears to keep the trailer moving on the slightest inclines. The turbos are undoubtedly working to make up for it, but the low-end torque from a turbo engine in general is just much better for towing than most V8s. My favorite feature in this truck that was never offered in the previous generation is the 360 camera. This isn't a gimmick, but rather something you're going to use pretty much every time you drive the truck. Most people can obviously still park without one, but it's not only safer being able to see around the sides and in front of you, it's so much easier to park perfectly in the center of a space, parallel park, or pull into a tight garage spot. This is by far the single best feature in my opinion. Unlike typical engine auto stop-start systems that shut the engine off at stoplights to save fuel, the Tundra's version doesn't just kill the engine when you stop. Instead, it flashes a message on the instrument cluster when you're at a light, reminding you to press the brake harder to activate the stop-start system. I really appreciate this workaround because there are many times you don't want the engine to turn off. Maybe it's hot outside, and once it turns the AC off, it starts blowing humid air, or maybe you're only going to be at a stop sign for a few seconds. I don't stomp on the brakes, so it almost never shuts off unless I wanted to. This is a great workaround because it's an extremely annoying feature that puts extra wear on the engine with negligible positives. Early models of this generation Tundra did have some issues with the turbo wastegate, but Toyota had supposedly switched suppliers, so the problem only affected a select few. 2022 and 2023 trucks have experienced bearing failures, meaning the engine basically needs to be replaced. Of course, the biggest question mark is the long-term reliability of the twin-turbo V6. Turbocharged engines never really last as long as naturally aspirated engines because they're under more stress and heat, but I do think Toyota put a lot of effort into designing the entire system to work harmoniously. Clearly, there have been some problems with the 2022s and 2023s, but that's typical with any redesigned vehicle, and even the last generation Tundra experienced problems with the V8 when it first came out. Having said that, cars aren't being built the same way they were before by any brand. Reliability seems to be getting worse across the board as they all compete for lower emissions, better gas mileage, and so-called lower maintenance costs. Moving on to the transmission, even though it's a pretty new design, Toyota rarely has widespread problems with their transmissions, so I highly doubt this one will be any different. Will this engine be as long-lasting as the 5.7-liter V8? Probably not. Will it be very reliable compared to most new cars out there? I think so. With mixed driving around town, in stop-and-go traffic, and on the highway, I average about 18 miles per gallon. This is pretty good, but not great, and really only a slight difference from the old V8 with the 6-speed transmission and no auto stop-start. The EPA estimates about 19 miles per gallon combined for most configurations, which would probably be achievable on a good day, but not if you do a lot of short trips, sit in traffic, or like to drive in the fast lane on the highway. Don't buy the hybrid expecting to get better gas mileage either, because it's designed to make more power, not get better mileage. People seem to think that the interior quality has gone way downhill, and I don't think that's the case. Some materials have been improved, but some are cheap. For example, the turn signal is definitely not as substantial as before. It feels a little loose and cheap compared to the older ones. The center console is very lightweight and cheap, which doesn't make any sense considering it's one of the most touched parts of the interior, and the shifter of all parts is really loose and cheap feeling, which is almost the complete opposite from before. The volume control for the radio broke off and the dial needed to be replaced because one of the plastic prongs snapped off. It's probably a hair less solid feeling than the last generation, but that's one of the most solid trucks ever built, so I wouldn't really consider that to be a bad thing. The solidness of the interior is still very good, and unless you're nitpicking like I am here, you're not going to notice a difference. A few spots feel cheap and chintzy, particularly the center console, but there are a lot of higher end materials used here too. The dash material and upper portions of the door panels feel high quality. The plastic on the steering wheel feels more solid and doesn't make as much noise as before. There are no squeaks or rattles. There really are a lot of positives and only a few small negatives, so I'm happy with it overall. The damp tailgate doesn't work anymore. When you press the button, it just slams down extremely hard and there's no assist when lifting it. This is probably as simple as replacing the hydraulic mechanism, but sure shouldn't be a problem with a truck this new. This isn't an issue isolated to the new generation, because there are quite a few older Tundras that have had this problem. The parking brake doesn't work anymore for some reason. There's an error message that appears on the dash every time you turn the truck on that says to bring it into the dealer, so that will have to be addressed. So here's the real question. Do I miss the V8? Yes and no. I absolutely miss the sound of the V8. Nothing will ever come close to that. Not the drone that you sometimes got on the highway and when towing, but the sound when it starts up just sounds much more fitting for a truck. And the exhaust sound when accelerating under a load at about 2500 RPM, where you get the rich, throaty intake and exhaust sound combined, just can't be touched with a V6. If you get the JBL stereo, you'll have the piped-in engine noise, which does sound good, but the fact that it's artificial is just a little tough to get over. The V8 is silky smooth at idle, where you can sometimes feel the vibration of the V6 shaking the truck at a stoplight with the AC on, whereas that was never a thing before. If Toyota had at least offered the V8, they would have sold so many more new Tundras, because there are countless truck owners who refuse to give up that excellent engine for a turbo V6 that comes with both pros and cons. However, they likely decided to only offer one engine due to a combination of ease of production and some formula for better emissions. Keep in mind that the Tundra isn't the huge money-making breadwinner it is for Toyota like the full-size trucks are for GM and Ford. After all, Ford and GM outsell the Tundra by something like 6 times each. Regardless, Toyota still sold the most Tundras in 2023 than they have since the 2006, 2007, and 2008 era. With pickup truck sales up across the board, just imagine how many they'd be selling if they still offered the V8. The Tundra has come a long way since the previous generation, with many improvements that make it easier and more enjoyable to drive. Even though the quality isn't perfect, and maybe not as quite as excellent as the previous one, it's still very solid. Would I recommend it? Absolutely. The last generation is an amazingly well-built, reliable truck, but it was really showing its age in terms of design. Some people like that old-school feel, but this one feels much more modern and up to speed. It's easier to drive, better power, and more car-like. Does it have its problems? Every car does, but I'd take my chances with this truck over the other options out there.